The moment my mother stepped out of the car, I knew this was going to be harder than I thought. Charlotte Charlie Carter had spent 27 years as a cop, most of it as Boston's first female police chief, and she was the toughest person I knew. But major back surgery doesn't care how tough you are. She moved slowly, her grip unsteady as she reached for my arm. Even as she forced a smile, I could see the strain behind it. She hated needing help. She hated looking weak. But right now, she was both. "You sure this isn't too much trouble, sweetheart?" she asked, wincing as she stepped forward. "Of course not," I said, forcing a smile as I adjusted her weight against me. "The guest room is all set up. You'll be comfortable in no time." I didn't mention how small she looked, how fragile in a way I'd never seen before. Instead, I focused on getting her inside, carrying her medical equipment up the porch steps as quickly as possible. But the moment I reached the door, I felt it, eyes on us. Across the street, standing stiff-backed with her clipboard in hand, was Margot Lancaster. HOA president. Community tyrant. A woman who had spent the last 8 years making everyone's lives miserable. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, her blouse crisp and pressed, her smile so forced it made my skin crawl. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She just watched. "Who's that?" Mom whispered, following my gaze. I clenched my jaw. Margot Lancaster. HOA president. Self-appointed neighborhood sheriff. Mom didn't say anything, but as I pushed the door open, I caught her stealing one last glance at Margot before stepping inside. "I've dealt with her type before," she muttered. I hoped she was right. Because by sunrise the next morning, there was already a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. I tore the violation notice off my front door, my pulse pounding as I read the fine print. Unauthorized resident change, fine, $100 per day until resolved. It wasn't just a warning. It was a full-scale attack. Margot Lancaster had wasted no time. My mother had been here for less than 24 hours, and the HOA was already coming after us. I exhaled sharply, crumpling the notice in my fist. I'd handle it. This was just a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic mix-up. Reasonable people would understand that my mother was not a tenant, she was recovering from surgery. I'd explain the situation, and they'd clear it up. But Margot wasn't reasonable. By the afternoon, my phone was already lighting up with messages from Jason Mitchell, the only sane voice on the HOA board. "Jason, Margot just called an emergency board meeting about your mom. She's claiming her medical equipment is a neighborhood aesthetic issue." I stared at my screen, rage bubbling in my chest. Neighborhood aesthetic issue? My mother had a hospital-grade oxygen machine and a portable wheelchair ramp. It wasn't like I parked a rusted-out pickup truck in my front yard. "Jason, watch your back. She's going door to door, pointing at your house." I walked to the window, my jaw tightening. Sure enough, Margot was outside, clipboard in hand, speaking to neighbors. Every so often, she'd gesture toward my house, nodding like she was discussing something very serious. I knew what she was doing. She was poisoning the neighborhood against me. 2 days later, a second notice arrived, and this time, it wasn't just a fine. It was a formal complaint from the HOA board. Eviction proceedings initiated. I read the words again, my stomach twisting. According to the complaint, I was in violation of the community bylaws for harboring an unauthorized long-term guest. I had 14 days to comply or vacate my home. The paper shook in my hands. Margot wasn't just trying to fine me, she was trying to force me out of my own house. I stormed across the street, fists clenched, and knocked on her door so hard I felt it in my bones. The door swung open almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for me. Margot smiled. Not a warm, neighborly smile, a calculated, satisfied smirk. "Emily," she said sweetly, leaning against the frame. "Is there a problem? You're trying to evict me?" My voice shook with barely contained rage. "Are you serious? My mother is recovering from surgery. She's not a tenant, she's my family." Margot sighed dramatically like she was dealing with a slow child. "Rules are rules, dear. The HOA residency guidelines clearly state that anyone staying longer than 14 days requires board approval. And since you didn't submit the proper paperwork," she trailed off, offering me a helpless little shrug. I could barely breathe. "You don't get to tell me whether my mother can stay with me." "Oh, but I do," she said lightly. "That's how good neighborhoods stay good, by enforcing policies. Otherwise, people start taking advantage." My blood ran cold. "Taking advantage?" I repeated, my voice rising. "She's in a wheelchair half the time. She can't even." Margot tilted her head, amused. "If you're that upset, Emily," she said with mock concern, "you're welcome to appeal the board's decision at the next HOA meeting." I clenched my teeth so hard it hurt. I knew how those meetings worked: rigged votes, stacked decisions. Margot controlled the board. The outcome was already decided. "I'm not going anywhere," I growled. Margot's smile widened. "Then I guess we'll see what happens in 14 days. I turned on my heel before I did something I'd regret. By the time I got back inside, my hands were shaking. I didn't tell my mother. She was already exhausted, already fighting just to move without pain. I couldn't put this stress on her. Instead, I called a lawyer, a friend from college who specialized in property law. She laughed when I explained what was happening. "She's bluffing," my friend said. "HOAs can fine you, sure, but they can't just kick you out of your home for letting a family member stay during medical recovery. That would violate state tenant protection laws." Relief flooded me. "So I'm fine?" "Oh, you're fine," she said. But Margot won't stop here. She was right. Because the next day, animal control showed up at my door. When I opened the door, the uniformed officer standing on my porch looked uncomfortable, shifting on his feet as he scanned the clipboard in his hands. Miss Carter? We received a report that there's an aggressive animal at this residence. We need to conduct an inspection." I blinked. "Excuse me?" The officer cleared his throat. The complaint mentioned a large, dangerous dog seen outside the property. It specifically noted concerns for community safety. For a moment, I just stared at him, waiting for him to realize how ridiculous this was. "I don't own a dog." He hesitated, glancing over my shoulder like he half expected a rabid pit bull to lunge at him from the living room. "I understand, ma'am, but we still have to follow up on all reported concerns." That's when I saw her, standing across the street, arms folded, watching with thinly veiled amusement. Margot. She even had the audacity to wave. My jaw clenched. This was her next move. I had refused to back down, so she was escalating, using official channels to harass me under the guise of following protocol. I turned back to the officer, keeping my voice calm. "There must be a mistake. I don't have a pet. And I'd like to know exactly who filed this complaint." The officer sighed, shifting again. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't disclose that information." "Of course." I took a slow breath, forcing my hands to unclench. "Well, since I don't have a pet, I assume this case is closed." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "For now." His gaze flickered toward the oxygen machine visible through the doorway. His expression softened slightly. "Look," he said in a lower voice, "I don't know what's going on here, but complaints like this? They don't just happen. Someone's targeting you." I swallowed hard. "I know." As he walked back to his car, Margot called out in her syrupy sweet voice. "Everything okay, Emily? No dangerous animals inside, I hope? I ignored her, slamming the door. That night, I stayed up late, sitting beside my mother as she slept, adjusting her oxygen tubes, my mind racing. Margot wasn't just trying to find me. She wasn't just trying to make my life difficult. She wanted me gone. And I had a sinking feeling she wasn't done yet. I was right. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke to a sound that sent a spike of terror through my chest. My mother gasping for air. I bolted upright, the room still dark except for the dim glow of her oxygen monitor. The numbers were dropping fast. Mom! I scrambled to her bedside, my hands shaking as I adjusted her pillows, pressing my palm to her back, trying to help her breathe. Her grip was weak when she clutched my arm. I can't, she wheezed. Her voice barely there. I didn't waste another second. 911, my fingers trembled as I pressed the phone to my ear. My mother, she just had major back surgery. Her oxygen levels are dropping fast. The dispatcher's voice was calm, controlled. An ambulance is on the way. Stay with her. Keep her upright. Help is coming. I clutched my mom's hand. Just hold on, Mom. They're coming. Then I heard it. A car door slamming outside. At first, I thought it was the paramedics arriving, but when I glanced out the window, my stomach turned to ice. Margot Lancaster's black Escalade was backing into my driveway. I could hardly process what I was seeing. Why? Then it clicked. She was blocking the ambulance on purpose. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding in my throat. This wasn't a violation notice. This wasn't a fine. This was life or death. I sprinted across the lawn, banging on her door like a madwoman. Margot! Move your car. Right now. There was a long pause before the door finally opened. Margot stood there, annoyed, like I had just interrupted her beauty sleep. Emily, she sighed, rubbing her eyes. Do you have any idea what time it is? I was breathing too hard to scream. My mother was dying, and this woman wanted to pretend like she was being inconvenienced. Move. Your car, I snarled. The ambulance is almost here. My mother can't breathe. Margot raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Then she glanced past me, toward the flashing lights of the approaching ambulance. And then I saw it. The way her lips curled ever so slightly. She was enjoying this. Oh, Emily, she tooted. You really should have requested prior approval for emergency vehicles. It's in the bylaws. Section 12, paragraph 8. I almost lost it right there. I took a step closer, rage shaking my entire body. Are you serious? This is my mother's life. Margot just smiled. Behind me, the sirens were getting closer. The paramedics would be here in seconds. But there was no way they could reach my mother with Margot's SUV blocking the only direct path. I turned and ran back toward the street, waving my arms frantically at the ambulance that had just pulled up. They saw the black Escalade completely cutting off the driveway. One of them cursed under his breath. We'll have to go around, the lead paramedic shouted, grabbing the stretcher and moving as fast as he could through my neighbor's yard. Their boots crunched against the frozen grass. Precious seconds slipping away. And then I saw Margot do something that made my blood run cold. She pulled out her phone. And started recording. I was frozen in disbelief as she turned the camera on herself. As you can see, board members, she said, her voice syrupy sweet, this is exactly what happens when residents fail to follow proper procedures. Unauthorized guests. Unregistered medical equipment. And now they want to blame the HOA for their lack of planning. I saw red. I lunged for her phone. Margot yanked it away, laughing. "You're insane," I whispered. Margot just smiled. Rules are rules. Behind me, the paramedics finally reached the porch. I turned to help them, forcing my rage down, focusing on my mother. One of the paramedics strapped an oxygen mask over her face. His voice was tight. "BP is dropping fast. We need to transport her now." Another paramedic, a tall guy named Mike, turned to me. "Why is that woman still in the way?" I took a shaky breath. "She thinks she's above the law." Mike didn't hesitate. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, be advised, possible obstruction of emergency services. Requesting police backup." And for the first time, Margot's smile faltered. Margot took a step back, her smirk faltering for the first time since this nightmare began. The radio crackled again as dispatch confirmed police units were en route. The lead paramedic, Mike, turned his body slightly toward me, keeping his voice low but firm. "Emily, we'll get your mom stable," but if she had lost consciousness for even a minute longer, he let the sentence hang, the unspoken words punching me in the gut. I knew exactly how close I had come to losing her. My nails dug into my palms as I turned back to Margot, who was still standing there, gripping her phone like it was a lifeline. The flashing ambulance lights reflected in her eyes, her mind clearly racing. I could see it, the gears turning, trying to find a way out, trying to twist the situation in her favor. And then she did something I never saw coming. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out an envelope, a thick one, stuffed with cash. Without hesitation, she extended it toward Mike. "Let's not blow this out of proportion," she said smoothly, her voice slipping into that same fake, HOA charm. "We're all just neighbors here. I'm sure we can work something out." Mike froze for half a second, then very deliberately reached down and pressed the button on his body camera. "I'm going to need you to repeat that, ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Margot's face went dead white. Her eyes flicked to the blinking red light of the recording device, and for the first time all night, she looked truly afraid. She stammered, pulling her hand back so fast it was almost comical. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. I was just trying to expedite the situation." Mike raised an eyebrow. "By handing me a cash-filled envelope after deliberately blocking an ambulance?" Margot forced a laugh. "It's a misunderstanding." "Oh, I completely understand," Mike said. His voice was sharp now, clipped. He turned slightly, angling the camera directly at her. "I understand that you knowingly obstructed emergency medical services, and now, you're attempting to bribe a first responder." The color drained from Margot's face. She knew. She knew she had just stepped way too far over the line. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. A fresh set of police sirens cut through the night air. Within seconds, a squad car screeched to a stop in front of my house, blue and red lights illuminating the scene. The moment Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of the car, his expression darkened. I had known Dan since I was a kid. He had been one of my mother's best officers back when she was still on the force. And right now? He didn't look happy. He took one look at the situation, the ambulance parked at an awkward angle, the paramedics rushing to load my mother inside, Margot still clutching her damn clipboard, and his jaw clenched. "Who called this in?" he asked. Mike turned to him. "I did. This woman," he pointed directly at Margot, intentionally blocked the ambulance from reaching a critical patient. When confronted, she then attempted to bribe me. Dan's entire demeanor shifted. His nostrils flared, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. Margot laughed. A brittle, forced sound. "Oh, come on, Officer Brooks. You know me. I'm simply enforcing HOA policy. The bylaws clearly state." I don't give a damn about your bylaws, Margot. That shut her up real fast. Her mouth opened and closed, her hands tightening around her clipboard like it was some kind of legal shield. I saw the way she shifted her weight, how she glanced toward her house. She was thinking of running. Dan must have seen it too because he took a deliberate step forward. Margot Lancaster, you are under investigation for obstruction of emergency services and attempted bribery of a first responder. Margot whipped her head toward me, eyes blazing. This is your fault, she hissed. You have no idea what you've just done. I met her glare head on. Neither do you. Dan stepped in, pulling out his handcuffs. Ma'am, if you refuse to comply, I will detain you for further questioning. Margot didn't move. She stood there, shoulders squared, jaw clenched, as if sheer willpower could make this go away. And then, from somewhere inside the neighborhood, a voice shouted. Check the HOA funds. Heads turned. I twisted to see where the voice had come from, but I couldn't make out the face in the growing crowd of neighbors who had come out to watch the chaos unfold. But then another voice rang out. She's been running a scam for years. Another. She fined my mother for leaving her porch light on. And another. She told me I couldn't plant tomatoes in my backyard. The murmurs spread like wildfire. People were stepping forward now, emboldened, angry. They weren't afraid anymore. Margot turned in a slow, stunned circle, realizing just how outnumbered she was. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist. But now? She had lost control. Dan's radio crackled. Another unit was on the way. Margot's face twisted into something ugly, something desperate. Then she did the last thing I ever expected. She turned to Officer Brooks, reached into her robe, and pulled out a second stuffed envelope. I can make this worth your while, she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Let's just forget this whole thing. Dan didn't even hesitate. He turned his body camera on. Ma'am, he said, flat and emotionless, did you just attempt to bribe a law enforcement officer? Margot froze. The entire street fell silent. Then, for the first time in her life, Margot Lancaster had no words. Dan sighed, shaking his head. Turn around. And then, just like that, he snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists. I exhaled slowly, watching as Margot Lancaster, the woman who had spent years tormenting this neighborhood, was finally escorted into the back of a police cruiser. A long silence settled over the street. Then, somewhere in the crowd, Tom Harris let out a low whistle. Welp, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Guess we're gonna need a new HOA president. And just like that, the tension broke. A few people cheered. Others laughed. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt something close to peace. 2 weeks later, I walked into the HOA emergency meeting with my mother by my side. She insisted on wearing her full police uniform, despite still recovering, and I knew exactly why. She wanted them to see her for who she really was, not just a woman recovering from surgery, not just another resident bullied into silence, but a leader. A fighter. Someone who had spent decades upholding real laws, not the twisted rules Margot had weaponized against this neighborhood. The community center was packed, tension thick in the air. Dozens of neighbors filled the seats, some whispering, others watching the remaining HOA board members with folded arms. They weren't afraid anymore. They weren't looking at me like I was the problem. They were looking at the real problem, the empty chair at the front where Margot should have been. Greg Thompson, the acting president, cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. We're here tonight to address the recent events regarding our former president. He barely got the words out before Tom Harris stood up from the back. We don't need to address anything, he called out. We need to vote. The room stirred, murmurs turning into agreement. Tom turned to the crowd. Who here believes Margot Lancaster should be permanently removed from the HOA board? Hands shot up everywhere. The vote was unanimous. Margot Lancaster was officially stripped of all power. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about how we let things get this bad in the first place. My mother stood, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. This isn't just about one person. This is about how power can be abused when there aren't checks in place. That ends tonight. She placed a folder on the table. These are safety protocols used by HOA boards across the country. They protect residents from harassment, ensure emergency vehicles have unrestricted access, and prevent board members from abusing their positions. If this board wants to earn back this community's trust, you'll implement them immediately. A murmur spread through the crowd. People nodded. Some even applauded. Greg exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I motioned to implement the Reynolds Emergency Safety Initiative. Seconded, someone called out. All in favor? Every single hand went up. That was it. That was the moment the power shifted. By the next morning, Margot and her husband put their house up for sale. The woman who had once ruled over this community like a queen had lost everything: her position, her influence, and most importantly, her ability to control people through fear. The neighborhood changed after that. People talked again. Helped each other. Neighbors who once stayed silent out of fear now stood together, refusing to let another Margot rise to power. 1 month later, I was elected to the new HOA board. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to make sure no one ever went through what my mother and I did. And sometimes, when I pass by Margot's old house, now owned by a kind family with 2 kids and a dog, I wonder if she ever truly understood where real power comes from. Not from rules and fines. Not from a clipboard or a title. But from a community that finally decided to stand together. So what about you? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or a Karen who thought they were above the law? Share your experience below. Let's see who had it worse.